Stories, unfortunately, I think can get us out of trouble, but they also get us into a lot of trouble. Um, so when we think about a lack of peace, we think about conflict, what gets us there is often a quest for power, right? We're like power over land, power like authority, even just like the power of who's in control of like what's happening in our neighborhood or our household. And one of the ways we justify taking that power for ourselves is the stories we tell. And a lot of the times we don't tell great stories about other people. And so we tell stories in many cases when we're seeking power that oversimplify other people or that make them kind of our polar opposites. Like that's what people say when they're talking about othering. Sometimes even these kind of bad stories that we learn as kids, it's not, the problem isn't just that they're not true, it's that they're so one-dimensional that we develop these stereotypes. So maybe our problem isn't even that we like think less of another people group. It's that we can only see their suffering. That's one example she gives, like for people from Nigeria, where we're like, that's not an authentic African story because it's about people like middle-class people flourishing. There were editors who would say to her, like, this isn't an African story because she wrote about her like comfortable, affluent life. Right. So we get these expectations. So the fantastic news is that there are so many stories to be found. And especially now, we have so many ways to access better and more diverse stories of people that maybe we don't know a lot about, or that maybe we have developed kind of biases or prejudices against. So as a lit prof, like I definitely think immediately of novels and poetry and short stories and the books I assign in my classes. But if you're not a reader, like it's like you can find documentaries, right? You can listen to podcasts. You can seek out stories of places that you maybe weren't thinking about. And the story of the Good Samaritan teaches us that our neighbor, it's not about who's next to us, right? It's about who we come across. And we live in a globalized world. Nothing we do in Canada is without consequence on the other side of the world. And so because we're so intertwined in that way globally, it's become the case that our neighbor includes the person on the other side of the world. I haven't found a way to quantify suffering. Like when you're in the middle of it in your own life, like that's your life. But the question becomes, how do we find a way, instead of becoming so self-centered that we can't honor other people's experience, how do we actually use those experiences of our own to open out into relationship? And I do think that like paying attention to other people's stories, whether in person or like in many of the forms of media available to us, is one way where we can begin to make that connection between our experience and somebody else's. But it might just take some discipline not to play the comparison game. And one of the incredible things is that we are wired as humans to feel, and we are wired to feel with other people. And this is the most basic definition of empathy, right? Empathy is feeling with someone else's feelings. That's not necessary, like it doesn't necessarily have a value. It's just what we do as humans. It's built in us. But as followers of Christ, this means that we are literally built to weep with those who weep and to rejoice with those who rejoice. And that I find that really encouraging, because it means that this command is something we already have the kind of capacity to do. It's kind of like in the structures of our brain. We have this rigorous command to love everybody, including our enemies. And they're throwing out maybe anger at us. And we're tempted to just like throw anger back. And the bad news with mirror neurons is that when we have prejudice against somebody or when we have anger against somebody, the capacity in our very brain structure to feel with them in a way that increases kind of good empathetic development, it's blocked.
Really?
It's blocked. And it can be blocked in ways that we're not even aware of. So there's research, they research this in laboratories. And there's research, for instance, that in the United States, a white person who sees another white person pick up a cup will have more mirroring brain activity than a white person who sees a person of color pick up a cup. And those results are worse in cases where people have recognized prejudice.
So what's
So
the
like,
hope then? So like, what can we do?
it's kind of scary, right? Like, are we stuck? That's the question, right? Like, are we stuck because I don't know, we're called to love. We're called to love people who we think of as our enemies, but also people who maybe we don't realize it, but there's a conflict with. But if our brains are kind of tripping us up before we're even consciously aware of it, what are we supposed to do? So there is more good news. I love that. I love, with God, I feel like there is always more good news. There's more research that suggests that if we can pause when we're faced with somebody who we think we might have a bias against, or when we're faced with somebody that we fear, or that we know we have prejudice against, or just somebody that we're kind of mad about, and we imagine their favorite vegetable, what's happening in our brains literally shifts. And what's happening there is that we're engaging our minds in a kind of meditation on their humanness.
Okay.
Right? So if I'm confronted with somebody that I have a problem with, and I'm like tight in that like give and take of anger, if I can take like 5 seconds to think like, well, I wonder what so-and-so had for breakfast today.
Yeah.
It shifts me out of that space of just confrontation and conflict. And it moves me into a space where I can begin. It's like the first tiny step in being able to recognize that they are a full and complicated human. And that might be the first step that takes me into a space where I could begin to even meditate on the fact that they are a child of God. This is what discipleship is, right? This is why our faith calls us to engage in habits. I think about this sometimes as taking every thought captive, which is a kind of a military metaphor now that I think of it. Yeah. But the more we practice pausing and imagining somebody else's humanity, imagining a better story, the more we take in other people's stories and begin to kind of internalize caring for people outside ourselves, the easier it becomes. And it becomes that way because our brains change, which is, again, I feel like really encouraging news, because we are called to a rigorous discipleship, but God doesn't call us to things that God doesn't also equip us to do. Like, we're not called to something impossible. We're called to something difficult. And also we are equipped by the Spirit to do it.